Okay, welcome to the Crow Discovery Project. On the tail of the last few clips I've put up, there's been a lot of shock, and I made the mistake of putting up the moon illusion clip, having done it aimed at followers, and I didn't really realize it was going to get so much traffic and be the first clip that anyone ever saw of my work, which is problematic with YouTube videos. It's very tough to recap everything that's been done in each clip moving forward. So what I'm going to do today is talk about things that are verifiable for people to try to put a common sense frame of reference out there so that people can look into it for themselves. Because I say something is true, you should not believe me. I hope you will consider it, but you should look into these things for yourself. So what I'm going to do here is simply put verifiable things out, and I will add some of the older reports that I'm going to put here. These people were marginalized, their reputations were attacked, and I think you should keep that in mind. I mean, look what's happened to me. I mean, I realize that it's quite radical what I'm saying, but it is in fact what I believe to be true, and you can see what people are saying about me on the tail of that. So keep this in mind when I cover the people from the 17 and 1800s. Anyhow, the first thing we're going to address here is, was there a time before there was a moon in our sky? And I think there is more than enough evidence to demonstrate that there was. So we're going to start with Aristotle. Aristotle talked about a people called the Pro-Selenes. And the interesting thing about this is the name of these people translates to a time when the earth was moonless. Democritus and Anaxagoras taught their students about the Arcadians, a race that was apparently on the planet in a time before the moon. Apollonius of Rhodes talks about the Arcadians in the same way, in a time before there was a moon. Ovid, Hippolytus, Plutarch all mention the Arcadians who lived before there was a time that there was a moon in the sky. And many of these people were teachers as well. They were teaching their students this. There was a man called Censorinus who talks about a time when the night sky was moonless. The Cordillera Indians of Colombia talk about the history of their people, and they claim they existed in a time before there was a moon in the sky. The Mayans talk about a time when Venus ruled the sky before there was a moon. This is all very interesting stuff, and when you see just how much of it there is, I mean, these are selected grabs. I mean, even the Bible in Job 22:5, let me see, it says something to the effect, don't quote me on this, before a moon and it did not shine is I think the way it goes. And you can also find a reference in Psalm 72:5, something to the effect of, thou was feared since the sun and before the moon, and then something about generation of generations. Now, we also have the Russian research, which I'm having a heck of a time getting translated well because it is so technical, it's difficult, and that document claims that the moon we see was put in the sky 18,000 BC. These are things that I will never be able to vet, but let's keep going in this common sense line of things you can look up. Now, one of the things I find interesting is behind closed doors and not really directly in the public eye, Nobel Prize people have talked about the moon being hollow. The reason this happens is because nearly everything we've been told about the moon is problematic. As a matter of fact, it is easier to find problematic accepted facts about the moon than to find normal everyday run-of-the-mill things about our moon. There was a man named Dr. Harold Urey, who was a Nobel Prize winner for chemistry, who commented on the disparity of density between the Earth and the moon and concluded that it had a massive cavity, or it was hollow. Dr. Farouk El-Baz, now there's an interesting man if you want to look up a NASA guy. He talked about density problems and came to the conclusion publicly, but not in the direct public eye, that there were caverns so big one would think the moon is hollow. Now, if we keep moving into NASA, Dr. Gordon MacDonald and Dr. Sean Solomon said that the moon is hollow. Wernher von Braun, who most people are familiar with, in 1970, I believe it was in Popular Science, said that Apollo 13 was going to probe the inside of the moon. We all know what happened with Apollo 13. But to top it off, Carl Sagan stated that a natural satellite cannot be hollow. So here we have all these people claiming that the moon is hollow, and then one of the most famous TV guys with a science background saying it's not possible for a natural satellite to be hollow. So when you begin to consider all these things, it just goes on and on and on, and everything I've mentioned here is verifiable. Think about why we quit going to the moon. One of the most popular reasons you hear is cost, that there was no bang for the buck and the public got disinterested. But depending where you look, you can get different numbers, but I think the closest I've seen is that Apollo cost around $24 billion, which was 2.7% of the budget for space exploration. Funny thing about that is the total NASA budget was 5.3%. So it can't be cost because the space shuttle that replaced it spent over $200 billion just servicing the Skylab. And the Skylab never did any amazing experiments that we were told about. It was ridiculous things with plants growing, falling in space, and things like this, all of which could have been done much more cheaply with just a space shuttle, frankly. So then it comes down to the Russians. Why did they quit going? And people use the Cold War and all these things as an excuse. The fact is the Cold War really kept going until December 26, 1991. And so, that argument doesn't hold water. Okay, so let's take a minute to talk about astronomers and others from centuries gone by who dared to say things that were outside the party line. And in the beginning, I warned you that people like this are often defamed. I think a couple names in what I'm about to cover are going to fall into that category, and I would thank some of the followers who did contribute some of this information. I was aware of it, but they compiled it all into a single post, and I did go back and look at this again. Anyhow, on March 7th in 1794, 4 astronomers, 3 in Norwich and 1 in London, wrote in the Philosophical Transactions of Royal Astronomical Society that they saw a star in the dark part of the moon. Now, for those of you that are wondering what that means, they're basically telling you that a star is shining through the black portion of the moon, and there are many reports of this, and with eclipses as well. Next up, Sir James South of the Royal Observatory in Kensington wrote a letter in the Times newspaper, April 7, 1848. He said, on the 15th of March, and here we are at the Ides of March again, coming up on the vernal equinox, on the 15th of March in 1848, when the moon was 7.5 days old, he saw a star go in front of the moon. He was expecting it to be occulted, which simply means hidden by the moon. In other words, traveling behind the moon so that it is hidden or occulted. What he saw was that the star was not occulted and traveled across the face of the moon. Next up, in the monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society for June 8, 1860, Thomas Gaunt stated, well, let me summarize this. He said that on the 24th of May in 1860, he was watching Jupiter and expecting the moon to occult it. He was using a 3.3-inch scope with 50 inches of focus. As Jupiter came to the limb of the moon, what happened was, as it traveled, it was not occulted by the moon, but traveled across the face of the moon and became a dark disk. And then he goes on to say that he has also personally seen stars through the edge of a waxing or waning moon. It actually happens fairly often. There are many reports when the moon is very young. In other words, there's just a sliver of lit moon that people have seen stars through the dark portion that you don't see very well. There are a lot of reports of this. Moving on. During a partial solar eclipse, Dr. Samuel Robotham, now here's one of the guys I believe that was defamed heavily, and you'll see why in a minute. He wrote in the Zetetic Astronomy with the title of Earth Not a Globe that the moon is not a perfectly opaque body, but a crystallized substance. And so what he says here is the exact same thing. When the moon is a few hours old, or even as much as a quarter, we can see through the unilluminated portion. Again, when it's young, you see the lit sliver. The unilluminated portion would be the dark, unlit portion that many people have seen stars and lights shining through this. And he went on to say not just lights, that he had also observed stars shining through her surface, and there's a reference there from J. Atkinson from the Earth Review magazine. So this brings us up to a pretty important thing. So many of the moons that NASA claims they know stuff about in our solar system, they know all kinds of stuff about these moons, and they're millions of miles away. Yet this moon, which is roughly, we are told, 250,000 miles away, and we are told that people have gone there and walked on it, they can't tell you how it got to be where it is. There are 5 popular theories, and I will just tell you what they are. If you have an interest, you can go look up each of these theories, but each of these theories that I'm going to tell you are so problematic that none are accepted, and I will prove that with the 5th theory. The first theory is called the capture theory, and it was popular up until about the 1980s. The second theory is the accretion theory. The third, the fission theory. And the fourth, the giant impact theory. Now the 5th here proves that there is no valid theory because it's called the georeactor theory, and it was proposed from 2010 to 2012. So just that recently, we have these guys still trying to come up with an explanation for how our moon got here, which tells you flat out the previous 4 theories don't hold water, and actually the 5th georeactor theory is no different. So here we have this thing that we've walked on according to NASA. We can see it beautifully even with small scopes. I have used a 2-inch telescope and a 90-millimeter telescope, and you get beautiful views of the moon even with small instruments. And yet NASA can't possibly tell you how it came to be. So what I'm telling you here is that I am very aware of how astonishing what I'm saying is. That the moon is a hologram. The face we see is not a rock in orbit. But when you begin to look at the things that I have outlined here, you can easily come to the conclusion that what you're being told by your space agencies is no less outlandish, except you've been told those things for so long, you're used to them. And, you know, that's I don't know how else to put it. They can't even tell you how the moon got there, and I have given you ancient references to a time before the moon was there. I have gone through and given you quite a few incidents of people witnessing things going through the moon. So as I wrap up here, we're coming into the spring equinox. I would urge everyone to film the moon, even if it's just with a camera or even a small scope. Small scopes do fine on the moon. The 3rd phase of the moon is very important for this, according to the Russian research that I've read, and I was saying near full, so that those 2 things jive with each other. I would also mention that it doesn't stop at the spring equinox, that all the way up to Easter and even a month beyond this is a critical point. The Earth is dumping so much energy in this time, which is why everything's blooming. At the end of the day, the cat's out of the bag, in my opinion, and the more people that look and film, they're going to catch things, and I think that this is not going away, and hopefully what I've presented here is a little more on a level-headed keel so people can look and research for themselves and begin to consider the things that I've said. It's unfortunate that I did the moon illusion clip thinking about my followers, not realizing that so many people would see that clip as the first clip of my work. But anyhow, I'll be working backwards now to try to go at it in the way that I am now, barring some incredible footage that I don't yet possess. So anyhow, there it is. Cheers.